Hello everyone, today we address briefly the historiographical question of the birth of chivalry, right? And the idea, and pretty much everything concerned with that, so could be knighthood, same time. The two things are different and too important to distinguish, but in a sense here we mean mostly the noblesse and the chevalerie, right, as overlapping terms, especially between the 11th and the 12th century onwards, as we will see, that we mostly identify, especially in fact in a low medieval perspective, as the what we think of chivalry in practice to be. Knighthood implies more the bond, right, with a superior order, right, and the subservience to some degree. But this is just to make every once in a while again some basic videos, some general videos to settle certain aspects from different perspectives, so that I've noticed that even more generalistic topics sometimes are more appreciated than others, and this helps structuring better our content. So it's obvious, and we know this as Clausewitzians as always, that knights didn't emerge as such for the simple military role, right? That it doesn't even make any sense to consider it just per se, right? There is nothing military that is not political and social at the same time, right? They definitely had a great success in medieval community and properly as a leading element that in here, in fact, should be properly framed as a spectrum of whoever was factually a miles, as the term was. We could identify the serf cavalryman of Eastern France as much as literally a king, right? In his military performance, right? As a heavily armored cavalryman, and there are, as you understand, many different criteria here we could indicate basically the same thing, but the obvious aspect that we will see better with the famous tripartition of Adalbert of Laon, Gérard de Cambrai, is the tripartite order of society, where the Bellators, the fighters, are conceived, in fact, not just as the filing rank troops, right? Those who just make war as soldiers at that point, which the term miles actually in the original Latin term is quite, kind of more reconnecting, right, semantically, by chance, but still significantly so, but referring also properly to the leadership of feudal Europe. The Bellatores are not just the retinues, they are properly the leaders, right? And just the other day we were making that video about the majesty in the German kingdom and what this was seen like properly together with the Imperium. And this is what, in fact, we tend always to overlook. That is, properly whoever had a factual power, just like the militasts start having as a class broadly meant, but properly from their ranks as the leaders of those societies, is seen as a divine sanction, and this had always been the case even before, right? When you think about the ideological roots of chivalry, this is something that goes far back in time to prehistory, even the Proto-Indo-European peoples and beyond, also in any other community where this military, this warlike culture fundamentally was necessary for those people, those communities, and that it's the background from which eventually chivalry evolved and kind of died out across the millennia, right, up to, you can argue, up to the 20th century at some point. In fact, this is I think theoretically the most important barrier to surpass when thinking about the roots of chivalry, is realizing that there isn't anything specifically medieval or technical or even Western strictly meant in the concept of that concept that we call chivalry, in a very romanticized and mostly 19th century mediated, filtered ideology that, however, is completely oblivious of the fact that basically any people before that time had those concepts already deeply ingrained within them, and they were essentially what those peoples had believed before. If you pick any people at that point, it could be the Roman Empire, could be the Germanic tribes, can be the Sassanid Persians, it can be everybody, right? They literally all believed fundamentally the same thing regarding to the divine derivation of earthly power through essentially a religious military ideology that was at the base of any cultural background of the ancient world, and in this sense beyond. In the Middle Ages we see a sort of secularization, paradoxically, even though the Middle Ages was, quite elaborating on that, exactly because during the High Middle Ages chivalry had taken over, right? So what we see, for example, is the birth of the so-called national monarchies, and so also the countries that are more resemblant fundamentally to the modern ones, especially England, France, etc. Well, these were essentially feudal monarchies at the same time. That is to say that, not quite anecdotally, as I was saying before, a king was not seen very differently from the other warriors, let's say. We were discussing it again in that video on the German kingdom the other day in the same way. It was still a tribal egalitarian ideal, which was really truly an ideal, because factually it had never existed even in the least stratified tribes back in the day, that everybody, that all the people had to elect a leader temporarily, right? So in feudal Europe you see something dramatically different. It is a dynasticization of power. We made a video about that also, incidentally, last week, on all the processes have to do with with the most of the socio-economic dynamics of the time, but not only, of course, always there political and military at the same time, that had made what we see as today, as properly as modern Europe, emerging factually from a privatistic system, right? Perfectly embodied by feudalism as such, and therefore by the same knights, by the same ideology that was elaborated at the time. Naturally, in a very different context from before. If anything, this was a Christian reality, for example, where the written culture was not completely, but largely, and sometimes there is an excess in this evaluation, but it's still significantly so, controlled by the church, so properly by the institution that actually in a civilizational function was trying to confer a greater organization and coordination and system and structure and rule to these still almost tribal reality, right? To give properly a leader, a leadership, to sanction one, to avoid, for example, the Europeans in that case to kill each other, and to channel their efforts towards an external enemy and all these things. So it's difficult for us when we study medieval sources that fundamentally start to re-emerging during the High Middle Ages as it's never satisfactory, but still by certain standard acceptable level of historiographical level of development. We see definitely something very different from the sources of the ancient world that are even scantier, and that, however, when studied properly from a philological, from a religious point of view, etc., reveal, as we have explained here and there, how much more ideologically violent the ancient world was compared to the even just the Middle Ages, which is the stereotype that fundamentally we haven't quite absorbed in the West, right? These were the same peoples coming from the primordial warlike societies of the migrations of the fears, just in fact military, purely religious and military cultures, and about that there is also a great disorientation, because for some reason we think that, I don't know, the Greeks of the Romans were some kind of lay modern peoples or anything like that, and most of the stereotype came from because the so-called barbarians were kind of more evidently warlike and inclined towards that primordial background, simply because they were more primitive in nature. But the truth is that, again, that all this thing was shared. And so when we look at chivalry, and we study it from a medievalistic interest very often, still, culturally speaking, we are falling into the very common mistake of not realizing that most of this creation we study, and albeit during especially the 12th century, was somewhat codified, was somewhat more outlined, or some older material was re-elaborated, and so on, is essentially a 19th century myth, right? And there has been an enormous consideration of this aspect. I mean, today we know it. Historiography definitely has acquired these ideas, but still, medievalism is quite a thing, right? People don't realize that it's some of them believe that they are looking back at the roots of those true hard people who were so loaded in ideals, and we have to come back being medieval, and they don't know that they're actually perpetrating a modernistic myth, right? And of course, without knowing a great deal much of that world, that in a way was much more powerful than we think in this regard, but not for the reasons people almost aesthetically think about, but properly from a moral point of view, and at that point also more controversially than sometimes those same people are willing to accept, because the reasons why often they buy in that stuff are darker than they're willing to recognize, especially nowadays, of witch hunting, and at the same time, before it was much worse than that, and however, for a reason. And that's the reason, that's that connection, right? That chain that brings back to the primordial origins of chivalry that is usually missed. There are reasons why we reason in this way, of course. Also, the modernistic and technologistic bias, the materialistic one. Marxism in Western universities surely, collects this as yet another, radical damage to properly our cultural education of considering. But there is much more than that. It's also progressism and positivism, and properly a very poor scientific education that reduced sometimes this phenomenon, not just from a materialistic point of view, a socio-economical ones purely meant in structuralism and so on, but also technologistic ones, right? Why did knights emerge, right? This is a myth that also conservatism bought in for a while, and I still encountered educators that were legitimately in love with the Middle Ages, but still falling a bit into this trick, if you to be generous. Another aspect that I try on Schwerpunkt to be quite clear about, and that may be in fact conflicts with a certain popular view of the Middle Ages, is spreading especially today has spread among millennials, among like me, by the way, and albeit I hope I have not bought it, at least I bailed out in time, is seeing the Middle Ages again, this kind of medievalistic myth, but of a sort of homogeneous medievalness that encompassed Europe for some kind of identity or deeply constitutive reason, right? Whereas, again, if you lack, if you study the Middle Ages and you don't study ancient history, or vice versa, or you don't study all history, you could argue, especially when we're talking about military stuff that need constantly for the art of war proper comparative and diachronic perspective, you cannot quite understand what that is, right? It's like things I always say that, for example, you cannot understand your country's history if you don't study other countries' history. And I properly mean it not just because it's not enough, that, like, literally at the root you cannot understand it by any positive standard. This exercise, of course, is beyond even just the educational possibility of most people, because legitimately not everybody's a historian, not everybody cares about, tertiary education, and it's fine because we have to work, we have to do other things, but at the same time, it's still appalling how this somewhat lives on still in the at this point, really pseudo-intellectual academic standard that has dramatically sunk in the last few generations, and it's bringing to certain disasters that we can assess from any moral, intellectual point of view at this point. By the way, in the face of a historiography, again, that when you search and you go look at, it's in many ways it's disappointing, but surely has produced at least the material for you to document yourself on. We arrived at a point where we produce so much historiography that sometimes we struggle to get the most updated one, or to completely ignore the fact that that's just the tip of an iceberg that was much more also properly scientifically consistent, even in times where a certain history was done ideologically speaking, and always understand that there are political reasons why history is made in the first place. So, where than another, and for better and for worse, right? The important is to know everything, which of course is unattainable, but still you should tend towards that, because the more you go that direction, the more work you do in that sense, and the better it is in the first place. So what I was saying, aside from this, is that, of course, what I was referring to is that the success of chivalry as such, of knighthood at this point, was not univocal or contemporary, immediate, all over Europe, right? And this is evident just within the post-Carolingian world that generated it. This is just a part of Europe in the first place. To remain within these boundaries, for example, in the Western Frankish kingdom, what would become France essentially, as Marc Bloch had already observed and was eventually verified by Georges Duby, the concepts of noblesse and of chevalerie between the 11th and the 12th century ended up to superimpose themselves largely, right? And that's, as we were saying before, the mold that kind of remained a bit as the main point of reference for saying, chivalry was like that in general, right? And that's the view we still have of it. Naturally, it wasn't like this in the same way. This naturally is more complex a bit than what it sounds, meaning that there were surely knights that were maybe serfs, or maybe kings, as we were saying, and all in between, right? But the balances swung depending on the country, right? And the reason why in France this had happened, paradoxically, was not necessarily a better one, right? Because the nobility had been recognized de facto by itself, right? Whoever was powerful enough and who detained factual power in an area could boast that that superiority, and therefore also dialogue concretely with the monarchy that controlled, by the rise of the Capetian dynasty, just the Ile-de-France, and therefore was factually even less powerful than some vassals, namely so, but still it's important also to remember it was maintained. So for them to recognize the same nobility of this, and naturally was a nobility that deeply overlapping in that sense with that equestrian culture that in Western Frankish kingdom was already a big deal before the 10th century, and can be dated back to much before. And so this was accompanied with the from the nobility, the seizing of important governmental prerogatives. They were the ones who factually ruled in a world, remember, that didn't quite have a universal ruler, especially in France, right? Meaning that, as we will see, yes, the Holy Roman Empire existed, but as we were just discussing in multiple videos, certain areas, certain regions that should have, especially from the post-Carolingian perspective, should have fit in, right, from the beginning, such as the same France, weren't quite properly affected by that direct authority. There was essentially not even an interest for that. In Germany, things were different. In the Eastern Frankish kingdom, and this is for some reasons that are somewhat paradoxical. That is to say, it's not necessarily that, it is true that the Renovatio Imperii had brought to a significant royal power in Germany and the possibility of reconnecting through the imperial bond with the Italic kingdom, with other surrounding regions, etc., and creating this, sovereign structure, we could say, superstructure. That was the same reflection, as we explained many times, especially talking about the Ottonians, of a power that literally floated over others, right? That the imperial title wasn't at all connected in that sense to a tighter control on, say, the Kingdom of Germany as much as the Kingdom of France could have, or at least while they surely had a greater ease to interact and to even in fact involve the various vassals within the royal imperial policy, still the factual territorial control was very limited, right? And things were not really to improve particularly much, because France, paradoxically, from that deep entrenchment of the Carpathians around Paris, etc., they began to expand and ultimately to become really a very solid, massive power. And as we've seen, instead, the German kingdom, after, especially during the 13th century, eventually fragmented, and the struggle against the centrifugal forces was fundamentally lost. So even in Germany, actually, you see that the real, the nobility was forming. This is particularly even with the ministeriales at the end of their period, but factually at the building of a seigneurial control, of a territorial power, right? So that when we see, for example, the same knights of servile status, so the ministeriales proper, we see there not much like a royal capacity of controlling better the territory through them, right? We just see essentially a lesser social stratification that kind of belated the feudal development as it had happened in France, and that gave partially this formal capacity of kings maybe to create ministeriales, which was done actually by any other prince of Germany as a private ruler and building its own kind of nobility along the Western Frankish model across the centuries, and in this sense not quite much of a greater hold of kings over the military resources of the country, considering in that regard that there was a specifically expansionistic purpose for which, a bit like it had been the Carolingians before, as long as you could go invade other lands that were richer and therefore more profitable. And so the Raumfahrten, to which the same imperial title was connected into Italy, to Rome, etc. Well, yes, somebody would come, and generally speaking, that wasn't even just very appreciated by German princes, that they mostly would desert those expeditions, but in a sense provided the country with this greater, this wider strategical range of operations, mostly towards the south, right? Because even towards the west, as we've seen, and the east even, towards the east there would be a significant expansion, probably a colonization, literally the creation of other territories. But as we explained many times, the great gamble, the most profitable one, was definitely the one towards the Mediterranean. That eventually failed, but still was the best option. And that in this sense doesn't quite show a consolidation of the German monarchy within Germany, something for which the 19th century nationalist historiography criticized the various imperial houses, because they had run after the Mediterranean chimera, all these things. Actually, there was an evident reason for that. That is, of course, ruling from Rome or from Sicily was surely more profitable than ruling from Germany, from where, in order to make a headway, they would have began by the 12th and 13th century to find, before they simply lacked resources. Now, her resources were increasing. Also, this was true for also the other vassals and their autonomies, and therefore there wasn't much profit from expanding, let's say, as a royal power from within the same German kingdom. They hoped to do it just essentially by means of political mediation, and this very also imperial ideology helped in that regard. So it was definitely a profitable attitude, but let's say a military occupation and mass of another area of Germany compared to from Franconia to Swabian to especially the northeast, was really not very profitable and wasn't factually done, right? Unless there was a rebellion, in case it was an expedition, mostly to punish or to settle somebody else on this and that duchy, etc. But the broader direction was objectively looking at a larger scale, and for certain intrinsic limits from within that same environment. So the ministeriales, in that sense, reflect this broader development, because some of them were true knights, others were something else. They were actually born as somewhat civil administrators, and then acquiring power and precision, therefore immediately, as in order to exercise a government and therefore violence, because there can't be one without the other, they would would militarize and become this class that by the 13th century was quite numerous, especially in southern Germany. It made up to 90% of the whole properly military force, at least the knightly one. And that became fundamentally in the 14th century that same status disappeared, because they had become so powerful on their own. They were equal to any other vassal, and even though they underwent a further crisis later on, they were indistinguishable from the other noblemen that at that point were rising during princely Germany far above this smaller knights. It doesn't matter how true knights they had become through this kind of social evolution. So it's somewhat complex, the path from which chivalry would become something more defined over time. And this was the fruit of a powerful ideological construction that is the one you see in by the late Middle Ages accomplished. I mean, this idea of moral superiority and a privileged status of knights per se, that eventually spread all over Europe, right, and therefore made nobility and knighthood properly overlapping also in lands that had even basically almost all of Europe, right, at that point, excluding the Ottomans that had conquered part of it, but all the rest was fundamentally it, like that. Maybe just the very far east of Europe had a different different models, but practically, right? Also, as we were saying before, the recent feudalism existed also in other cultures. And what is feudalism after all, if not just a military clientele that entails some kind of enfeoffment and therefore this prepaid, granting of land that would be ever more mediated and, just not quite, it was consigned, but just would pass down, especially with the dynastization of the ruling classes that we were documenting recently, and that therefore we see as our feudalism as Western. But if you go in other countries, that there is something similar. Not quite. Maybe it is true that Western feudalism, Frankish feudalism, had a distinctive capacity that was essentially a very pervasive one, socially speaking, and that managed to transform the European continent in a way that wouldn't exist quite elsewhere, right? And I made videos very early, in the very early Schwerpunkt days, that actually explain a bit this thing. But of course, this has to do mostly with two greater systems to be addressed in just, especially this video that is talking about really something else. So historiographically speaking, somebody at some point, right, wondered legitimately why, right, chivalry was born, right? This is a very old historiographical theme in a way, and there have been different approaches. One of the best ones was definitely the one of the Italian author Cardini, at the roots of medieval chivalry, or that had the great merit to surpass previous interpretations that were connected, in fact, to purely technical or mechanical aspects, right? Think about the American Lynn White Jr. and the bullshit of theory according to which knighthood would have been born because of the stirrup, right? That is one of the most radically illiterate ways of interpreting any kind of historical background, properly not understanding anything about history of technology, history of science, history of economy, properly zero. And that this tells you how deeply, right? If these have been the top thinkers in the West, you start realizing how serious the problems that we have are from a cultural point of view, right? The syrup didn't change a good nothing. As always, technologies are essentially adopted into systems that require them and then produce them appositely for carrying out a function that have already developed by themselves. Syrup proceeds mostly in Europe, mostly seemingly from the other invasion onward, but some peoples already had developed. We don't, because archaeologically speaking, yes, we can see the iron ones, but I don't think even kids, right? Sometimes there are, aside from the organic material that doesn't quite survive it, but it doesn't take a genius to understand that you can use some kind of support in order to be on horseback, right? We have tombs of children from around the same time that provide with such events. But the question here is connected, obviously, from a purely military point of view, to the increasing collective training of cavalrymen. That is to say, cavalry in the ancient world, the sedentary world, wasn't the prevalent arm, as you know, was subordinated to infantry. And in the early Middle Ages, you have the switch for which cavalry takes over. And the reason why this happens naturally is broader, right? It's not just ideological. It has to do, obviously, with the different distribution of wealth, with the idea that feudalism definitely increases the riches of very few people, that for which all the rest of society work, in order to provide them with this, not much the single horse or the weaponry etc., that already cost a lot, but essentially the lifelong fuel, right, resources properly to practice continuously mounted warfare, either in real war or in training, which frankly at that point weren't much different from one another, much distinguishable from one another. And the creation of this new class by the 10th century brings to the fore the fact that before, of course, cavalry had always existed, had always been at the root, right, with as Cardin explains, of the property of medieval Europe, from the peoples of the steppes, from the first early Indo-European migrations. I mean, properly these ancestral values that put at the center the idea that every freeman had to be a horseman. And this is something you find, in fact, in all Indo-European mythologies. Doesn't matter whether most of these peoples were sedentarized during the ancient world. If you look at all Indo-European mythologies, you have that everything revolves around mounted warfare, properly as a radical archetype, right? It's not. And from this, all in fact the misunderstandings that we have done for other modernistic reasons of conceiving certain ancient civilizations as republican or democratic, they had nothing to do with that, right? They were oligarchic at best, and they were deeply imbued with a almost psychopathic obsession for bloodshed and heroic sacrifice in battle, and that was the root from which everything descended. What happens in medieval times, we were saying before, is that this thing is regulated in a more professional way because there is a class that is formed properly by the 10th century. There are few people compared to the rest of the population, but post-Carolingian Europe-wise, and eventually for this Frankish expansion all over the rest of it during all the medieval centuries, from this clamorous success of this system, it spread at a point where there were lots of people that internationally even could recognize themselves as peers, right? Because they practiced the same lifestyle. They were all horsemen. They all fought with that kind of professional, status, at least individually speaking, and they had lots, or enough, in fact, companions in that regard to train collectively, right? This before hadn't quite happened the same way. The closest thing to a feudal society in Europe before medieval times was ancient Macedon, right? And in fact was radically imbued with a Western culture. But why? Because they were essentially a feudal society. They were these landowners of this pastors of in the Balkans that could practice in that level. They had very few, if you want, all over the population, but all the population worked for them, and hence you have Macedonian cavalry, that completely different mindset that had formed in Greece by a certain standard, by the rise of Macedonia and Alexander's empire. But that was it, right? And not even in that context cavalry had been enough to surpass infantry. Cavalry, as we've seen, was quite young, right? It's just from the Iron Age that, from chariot warfare, you transform into something else properly as a consistent mounted force, right? By medieval times, this thing is crystallized almost by this feudal preeminence of this few, that, however, are few, but also many enough to train together for collective training. Now, collective training means that before, if a single horseman smashed into an infantry line, normally it was done for, because, of course, cavalry always operated in large numbers, and we underestimate how important in the ancient world still this was in the sedentary world, but it didn't have enough collective training because it didn't stem essentially from a feudal society, and the result was that, of course, it didn't have enough impact power for even charging. I mean, think even the difference between hippos handles and horseshoe, medieval horseshoeing. Stirrups. These things were created, were developed, were integrated from other people, and because finally cavalry had the the level of training necessary to maintain this thickly packed formation to literally smash into enemy infantry quite physically meant, and therefore needing a dramatically greater stability on horseback that before could be easily achieved for the tactical purposes of the time just by having very strong thigh, right, and surely charging, because cavalry has always charged by the foe, but still not with the same force, and especially not the same collective concentration as before. Muslim authors from the Reconquista tells us that Spanish knights literally chained themselves to the horses, because at every impact, otherwise they would have been literally catapulted, out of over the horse, over the enemy line, because the impacts here we're talking about, they're very, very serious things, right? Not just your charges normally were led at something like 45 kilometers per hour, sometimes even less, depending on the type of cavalry, but quite medium, you can think like that, right? So double that, because you're charging very often not a static foe, but fundamentally another one is counter charges. So I don't know if you go, if you like motorcycles or bicycles, whatever, and you have ever gone at 45 kilometers per hour. You say, oh, it's not that much. Have you ever stopped thinking at that point what it means to crush against something, and not just again a static thing, but something that comes directly opposed to you at that same speed? These were medieval battles, and if you were not essentially a psychopathically and psychiatrically traumatized individual that had been repeatedly abused, destroyed, and rebuilt by the unspeakably violent training that served to be a knight, you couldn't quite have the guts to even dream to think to mount on horseback to do that, right? So that's yet another thing that is probably the single most overlooked thing. That is, I would say, it's the single most important thing in warfare, properly, the moral dimension of it, right? If you are not a psychological profile of that kind, which fortunately today, I think not even in the most viciously traumatic context we're able to reproduce functionally in that sense, you cannot even imagine what that means, right? And this is reflected by the whole chivalric culture. That is to say, people were versed sometimes with some of the greatest artistic, poetic, and inner sensitivity, and that could butcher newborn babies just in a blink of an eye. They would do it, right? I don't know if you've ever read medieval chronicles and properly what was warfare by standard, right? That's another thing that historiography hasn't quite helped us to look at very much, because even though I'm a great re-evaluator of the histoire bataille, but not quite such, but properly battles as such in the art of war, and I specialized in tactics. I wrote 700 doctoral thesis on just that in the for the early 14th century. What really matters overwhelmingly in this is the broader situation. That is to say, what did knights actually do normally, aside from pitched battles that were somewhat rare, right? Somewhat, not that rare as you may think, actually, but surely heavily outnumbered. But all these other encounters that were mostly just about plundering, looting, and committing the most horrifying kind of atrocities, which was completely universal in the world, in every single culture at that time. Actually, the Westerners, as well as other civilizations in Eurasia, had developed refined moral, philosophical, religious standards. The rest of the world was pure insanity, but even there was, of course, a specific reason why that had to be so. But that insanity is what was needed, in fact, to survive within the aristocrats, within this oligarchy, within these people that were literally having the whole burden, the whole moral and physical burden of the world, of the entire world on their backs, right? I'm utterly disgusted by classist interpretations of history, not just for obvious political reasons, but also because of perhaps the greatest lie that's ever been told, that is to say, the fact, of seeing the elite as just a sort of parasitic oppressor that fundamentally just lives at the expense of the poor people. This is, of course, what mediocre people need to believe to as an alibi, not to admit that the way they are is because they don't have enough moral, not material, force to withstand that. And history proves how things change when people really are provided with some capacity of that kind, and that instead, by studying history, just if you see it from a perspective of command, of hierarchy, of discipline, of authority, you know that who's at the top is constantly crushed by the single most devastating moral burden ever present in all the rest of the community, right? These knights, as the same kings, they had on their shoulders not just the matter of it's not even about their personal survival. It's literally about the expectation of a whole world that is judging them as much as God is doing in this necessary unitary psychological realization that you must do this for a higher purpose, for a purpose of justice, for a moral that was deeply felt at the time, and that we have completely decided to forget, because again we are not up to that kind of sacrifice anymore as individuals, and that's how deeply we have fallen in our degradation from a moral and probably our own dignity as a human beings, right, compared to these people, and this is around which what the whole chivalric ideal really corresponds, right? You could see this grown men, this grizzled veterans that again could rip a person's heart out with their own hands without too much trouble, and that would break down in tears when they were sung this beautiful pieces of poetry talking about this kind of angelic courtly women that reminded them of their mothers that they had to leave when they were 6 or 7 years old, not to see them anymore, or their sisters that may had died, as it was so frequently, of birth, of labor, as they were married when they were essentially still children, in this world where, again, 1/3 of born children would simply die, right? They wouldn't reach their own maturity, and therefore a completely different view of life and death compared to our own, with a pressure, a sufferance, a constant individual requirement that today, I don't know whether fortunately we cannot understand anymore, but these things should be deeply absorbed, understood. We should always go to bed and wake up in the morning thinking about what life concretely is, and then maybe trying to be a better self, being inspired by certain things, because this was a reality that was true not very long time ago, and that today a person in the in today's world that complains because life is hard, these people would have simply spit in the face but they would have simply killed, I presume. That there would have not been any kind of properly of dignity to be seen in us. There would have been any moral consistency, any logic, any even rationale, because whether we accept it or not, these societies were not enough to scientifically outline these principles, but they had completely absorbed them. They were part of them. These societies were functional to themselves. They were presented every time with a chance of failure, meaning death, and for you and for whoever you love, for them to simply act upon it without thinking that much, right? We are the ones who need manuals to make things work. These people would just go there and make them happen, right? If you wonder how, I don't know, a Godfrey of Bouillon from Belgium that had never, even conceived what Palestine or Syria could be, could mount up a perfectly disciplined and excellent expeditions, such like the second one of the First Crusade, the one of the Barons, to go literally from the thousands of kilometers away to conquer Jerusalem, and even making it, right? Try to do it yourself. Once a day. These are the things you can try at home, and simply because you will fail anyway, so there's no risk for you to do anything wrong at that point. So the syrup was just there to serve a universe in which the syrup by itself was somewhat even irrelevant, right? And this is just proven by the enormous graduality through which it was used, right? Ideas traveled extremely quickly. One of the greatest prejudices towards the older worlds is that man, that time information traveled, it took so much time, years to travel from one place to another. No, literally, who had the interest and the means to make news travel like in a few weeks, could know it all over Europe easily, right? It's not really a matter of opinion. This is literally how it was done at the time. If you see how they coordinated themselves, how peoples rose and were suppressed, how revolts happened, counterinsurgency, broader international cooperation, you realize that they were perfectly synchronized. They knew everything about what they needed to know, and so the fact that the stirrup took, like the others migrated into the Danubian basin by the 7th century, I don't know, by the time of the Bayeux Tapestry, so in the most radically developed feudal societies of the time, such as the Norman one, you find still some knights, that do not use a stirrup, right? And so that is quite eloquent by itself. It took a long time before this thing systematized, through which the same feudalism evolved, and therefore the stirrup by itself is nothing but an obvious tool that would have been introduced anyway, independently from any other kind of exposure to this hyper secret, developed, sophisticated technology that nobody would have ever guessed otherwise, and there would have not been a heavy cavalry of that kind, for sure, right? The same myths we have, for liquid fire that exists literally since the ancient world. We have to fixate that there is published an article that, maybe I haven't read it, but it's that reflects, in my opinion, the level of collective idiocy at which we have arrived in popular culture. The title is very provoking. It says, things like catapults are not nuclear weapons. That is to say, really, maybe the article is perfect, but is there really a need to explain people that this is the case? Well, this tells you how dramatically uneducated and properly not strategically so self-styling military historians are at this point, right? If a prominent scholar like De Vries that studied a lot of medieval warfare, I don't agree with lots of things he says and also the way he worked, but he's still a great read if you are just interested in the whole thing, but needs to write an article at this point in history. You realize that evidently nothing else has been written in very different ways, right? You don't really need much to know how catapults or other siege, throwing engines were employed, right? If you have studied again regularly medieval sources, you have an idea, probably a palpable one, of what was the relevance in siege warfare, in other contexts, these weapons, how they were employed, and obviously, again, it's always about the doctrine, it's not about the technology. Well, evidently, this is something that we still have to teach historians, and specifically military historians, about, by the way, a period like the Middle Ages, where military organization wasn't this dramatically complicated. So imagine if these, what could be like for contemporary military historians. But let's not even talk about this topic, because it's partly the possibly the greatest reason why I have started Schwerpunkt for in the first place, and that believe me, for having seen these things from the within, academically scares you, right? Because you think that the world is in the hands of scientists, and therefore, we are safe, right? Where certain things do work, right? But if you consider the broader picture, you say, are we really still this primitive and incapable properly of communicating within a scientific reality? That is to say, shouldn't such things be obvious to anybody who claims to have certain competence? I don't know anymore. So it's obvious that the ideological and cultural factor had, an enormous importance in surely among the greatest ones within the self-representation of the ruling classes, right? In France before, and eventually in the rest of Europe, and definitely in an era like especially the High Middle Ages, where still, in spite of this collective training we have talked, of course, the knights needed to be, physically strong, spiritually courageous, right? So we know that this was true for any kind of warrior since the dawn of times, right? The important there was the increased professionalization, collective capacity, military organization, and all this stuff. But it was, let's say, there was something still very individualistic in these knights. It was still a belief that, in a way, the way to save the day was still connected to their own individual valor. And this because definitely as individual fighters were extremely expensive by themselves, right? They were not just top in collective training, but also individual training, right? Because they could find themselves. And this tells you how often this would happen compared to the big pitch battles if you want, individual contexts, right? These were brutal environments in the first place, even just in, there wasn't really a difference between military or civilian lifestyle for them. So they would always have to be able to fight for their lives in any context, right? And this is very important because it's something you find even in other military historical contexts. Polybius' passage on the Roman legionnaire, for example, is quite eloquent when he says, they had to be ready essentially to fight in any circumstance, if properly armed. Doesn't matter whether in information or individually, but so that they were trained for that. And this is very important because in the broader legacy of military legacy of Europe, there are different currents, there are different cultural backgrounds, right? Here we see mostly a Latin Germanic reality, right? And the Romans had brought from their side this idea that collective training, authority, discipline, collective training were fundamental. They knew better because they had struggled that hard to transform Italic warriors into Roman soldiers. But that pinch of individualism was still necessary, and especially couldn't be eradicated, or shouldn't be eradicated, because first of all it's impossible, but secondly you need that kind of individual value in order to fit in as a group, right, and to make things work collectively as well. And this is a very, the Romans, as you know, weren't much of philosophers or particularly sophisticated minds, but they definitely had realized something that it's deeply anthropological. It's almost a Clausewitzian concept, as a matter of fact. It is to say, differently from the Greeks, where Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War, there's a passage in which he states openly that fundamentally discipline was all, and that the individual was nothing, right, completely, right? This is not true, right? And in war, that individuality is always relevant in a way or another, right? It's just, of course, when you look at the bigger picture, of course the individual is virtually irrelevant, but this is true, of course, the more the system is developed as such, right? By these pre-industrial societies, well, the difference was not so accentuated, like later times. So the realization that, of course, there had to be, first of all, a moral force, independently even from the collective or the individual, right, with the evident asymmetry in favor of the first, but properly that there had to be a conviction, a deep belief, a faith, right? And remember what I said at the beginning about the religious military beliefs of these peoples, that were all one, right? Their whole deal was to fight. This is something that the same Christianity adopted unavoidably, right? When they had to convert the Roman world, except they had to properly do it with a language that would fit the militaristic mentality of that society. Such as that living is to serve, militarily speaking, that there is properly a struggle, life is fighting in all things. And this is, in fact, an element of Western mentality that never quite died, right? We Europeans by ourselves, we are quite aggressive, right? We Westerners in general, we are much more than we're willing to recognize, right? It's just the fact that we're not motivated is not doesn't erase that, culturally speaking. And this was, you need to be aggressive if you want to create a civilization. You cannot sit there, just doing nothing, letting everything happen without doing anything, or just taking it. You do need to go out there to make order out of chaos, right? To properly use force and to bring order and justice and a sound development. And this is something that lived on in the veins of these knights that were literally descending from the Gallo, Roman, Frankish, whatever, the rest of Europe as the hybrid in their midst, in the idea of a civil order, but accompanied also by the Germanic warrior mentality that was, again, not particularly because it was Germanic, but it was properly a tribal warlike one, right, or a people that up to 1,000 years before was literally classified as a prehistoric one. And so this is particularly relevant and we made a lot of videos about the origins of knighthood in this perspective, for understanding the reasons of this success, right? Not just the technicality, not just the physicality. This is something that existed everywhere, right? If you look at, the mental and physical preparation to war is in certain cultures all over, the Middle East. So it was as powerful as it was. What now naturally the West was bringing in was a much more, it's difficult to define it as a synthesis properly of certain elements, right? Of civil principle and warlike fate and freedom of conscience that and scientific rationale, right? That had, albeit primitively, being brought together and in this extremely, in fact, tough time, but it's been so hard, it's been so pressed, almost like as if in a geological formation, to a model that can be reflected by in their older systems that also have been historiographically quite debated in the famous theory of the tripartition of society, right? Formulated, explicitated, at least by the beginning of the 11th century, by two bishops, such as Adalbert of Laon and Gerard of Cambrai, that, as you know, had this schematic subdivision of the community to those who pray, the oratores, those who fight, the Bellators, and those who work, the laboratores. So this, first of all, it's important to understand, was an ecclesiastic creation. We know very few of what the militasts believed at the time. And the perspective was, of course, that these three orders had to harmoniously cooperate, right? But at the same time, there was a hierarchy that naturally saw at the top the priests, right? So the sacred, the purest from a moral point of view, those who were the medium with God, followed by the warriors, to whom was, however, brought down all the rest of the population, right? So it was subdued all the rest of the population. And so the Bellators, as we were saying before, were not just the knights, but they could be the political power altogether, right? Which is, if you want, a Clausewitzian concept as well, because it shows how the military instrument was, of course, disposed of by the leadership, and that were in this sense all one, right? Still, the horsemen had this primate, so much that the term miles, as you know, it becomes exchangeable with one of equus in Middle Latin, and this is an old, let's say, model that has been also associated naturally to the Indo-European ideals, right? You know, of course, of the idea of priesthood from which everything descended. So we find them not so clearly in all Indo-European societies, but we know, and not into the same exact repetition. Of course, there was a sacredness. There were those who officiated the religious rituals that had some kind of purity and as media from God. Of course, this could overlap in part with the same warriors, right? And if you think at the monastic military orders, you see there is something like that. So it's not really clear, actually, but the society at the time surely wasn't really divided properly like that. There is, this is not important, but the idea is that there could have been some anthropological connection to this but obviously so, the pre-Christian, not to say that the Christians stole things, because a person who studies properly the Bible knows that that stems from doesn't stem, but it was quite a pagan thing, right? You know, monotheism isn't born out of a vacuum and stealing the pagan stuff. It's just the same paganism evolving into something else, right? So that's also where the contemporary theophobic and anti-theistic perspective completely prevents to understand such a refined civilization like the medieval one, because of course, you know, it was stemming from, but this is just, you know, gross ignorance in terms of history of religions in the first place. But it normally, the idea that you know, there's been this plot which is also subtly racist, that fundamentally, you know, there was this southern terrible, you know, Semitic cultures that stole the things that the great pure Aryans believed in the north. No, it was all basically the same, you know, it's very easy to study it from, even if you just have read the Bible once in your life, for that matter. But since this is apparently now, it's not random that monotheism was adopted in the West, nor the fact that it was specifically Christianity, nor that the same Christianity was born with a specific, within, first of all, a specific context, read Roman Empire and all what could derive from that, but not only for that matter, were influenced dramatically by other religions and philosophies, but even in there always somewhat connected to what this broader mentality really was. Think about Persia, that surely had a lot in common with that Indo-European equestrian mythology, and properly this you know, kind of important separation properly from the spiritual ideal and the earth, the world, right? This is a deep divide, one between the celestial perfection of order and that has to mold the matter, the tectonic element, right? That it's so evident, even in the tripartition here presented. Who are the Bellators? They are superior individuals. They were thought as such, right? They were, I will explain it many times, who were the peasants. There was properly an idea that those who had won in arms were superior people that had the right to rule. Literally, if you had gone in the Iron Age, wherever, in Central, North, the idea is that it's that, I mean, the word is that simple. If you have the strength to take away stuff from others, you can do whatever you want. And you're divinely legitimized to do it. So also this bias towards the peasantry, towards the lower classes, etc. Because because the warriors knew how much it costed to win those prizes, and these people, by losing them, were felt by them to be morally inferior, and therefore also something else, because they wouldn't kind of, select themselves enough or to bring something. And it is indeed the affirmation of chivalry, oppressive in a way, so much that before the early 14th century, the infantry, the classes that expressed them, were relegated in a condition of moral and material inferiority, and wouldn't be able to defeat cavalry up to that point, right? But just to accompany them. Naturally, there is always a compenetration, right? But this sense of the conqueror as the warlike conqueror that, celestially inspired, that puts order in this underworld, is very powerfully imbued in most of this. It's the divide between also the nomadic, the sedentary world, in the warlikeness and kind of more civilized development, and it is from this synthesis that the world, however, emerged, because it was understood, of course, that you need a bit of both in order to make things work correctly. There could be many other considerations. I'm just digressing maybe in this aspect, but always remember of the roots of this all. These weren't things invented in the Middle Ages. They existed all before. And the magic of it was surely there still by medieval times. It was, in fact, as you know, a complex system of ceremonies that served to determine, to condition the belonging of single individuals to the milites category, right? For example, the dubbing of, investiture, the adoubement, right? It was derived from the right of the weapons, of the arms consignation that indicated the entry of the tribal warriors in the adult age. Medieval times, we see it mostly from a Germanic tradition, because those were the peoples that had it up to that point. But this again was proper of all the Indo-European cultures, and even in the sedentary ones, it had somewhat survived in some ways, right? And the fact this was sanctioned further was not because of any specific ethnic derive, but because now the militia was becoming a big deal, right? But rites of passage into manhood, and therefore warriorhood, and to individual freedom, are at the base basically of any anthropological, any people that I am aware of in them. And by the way, these are very valuable things, so much that at the beginning, these this thing was, you had to go through tests, right? So what you see in that path, that curriculum, let's say, we're addressing before the fact that these kids were basically taken away from their families, going to be educated, to other nobles' houses, so to grow also in their regions, etc. And they were brought under them and all the other kids, and there was a vicious abuse to literally transform them into killing machines. Is exactly what eventually was sanctioned through the dubbing, right? It was literally saying, not you begin here, but you have already begun, and here we give you we recognize you as a knight finally, right? And you had to go through hell before reaching heaven. And as you know, these knights were quite celestial but inferior, creatures themselves. And chivalric literature is full of these references that you couldn't quite distinguish whether these people were angels or devils, because of course they had to maintain a moral standard, but what they had to do in order to maintain it, right? And of course the exclusive function of any military is to exclusively physically annihilate the enemy, That's the only reason why armed forces exist, why the military exists around the world, in any culture, in every civilization. It's not about job opportunities. It's not about... These things exist, but they're conceptually separated. If you want to win wars, the military element by itself is about annihilating physically other human beings, and there is no other thing in between. And it should be like that, because if it is not like that, we wouldn't know how to defend civilization itself, our freedom. We wouldn't attribute a value to resistance, from tyranny to oppression. So these people, as we were saying before, were the top of the military culture. These were the ultra elite of a world that had never quite seen... Well, okay, in the past, yes, there were similar things, but at this level, development of human communities in Europe, etc., with the, technology of the time, with the broader growth, development of the world that woke up from the mists of the mythological, the superhuman past, let's say, lost in the there was a point at which history was indistinguishable from the myth, right? So at this point, we are lucky enough, just even as human beings, having had this reality is documented, right? Because these things happen also elsewhere historically, but they're not as documented as in Europe, right? For many reasons, unfortunately. But that's where, if you want to study, wherever you come from, if you want to study military history and try understanding anything of it, you cannot but pass through all these stages, because they show you not just an army or how they fought, but what were humans at war during the ages, and during a stage of development that is not just, exchanging, the medieval as equivalent as the ancient or the modern, as if, these were not part of a broader civilizational development. They are, right? And we don't have so many other peoples documented in the same way to understand how they related to war as before. Just videos that we've been making about, for example, the wolf bear warriors of the Norse, the early Germanic cultures, where basically that's universal. That happened literally in every single people on Earth. The problem is that normally these contexts are not satisfactorily documented. Instead, we documented Germanic culture from an early age, from peoples that could write and study them, and even were kind of akin to them, to understand a lot of things themselves, recognize much of their own past, see, from Roman times to think about the later historiography, the Viking era, etc. So to understand even there, literally how a prehistoric people passes into something, civilizational, and that is literally studying the individual behaviors, the mindsets, this world that was all one between, magic and you can't really draw even a difference, a boundary. Right here, the myth, the saga is both real, and it's both history and myth at the same time. It is the expression of certain values that culture had, and these things existed also before basically any other people. It's just that we didn't document them at the same level with the spread of literacy and the possibility of understanding, even when mediated, but with the same way we could do with I don't think there is any other people in the world that has the possibly, even in the future, any chance, properly from the sources that were written about and we could find, that can document this passage. So that's why the history of knighthood cannot but pass through this historiography, because otherwise you come up with such things like, chivalry developed because of stirrups, right? You cannot manage a civilization if you think things like these. Like you lack dramatically the moral intellectual tools to be able to do it. And again, that's what we're witnessing at this point, unfortunately. So refer to the dubbing ceremony, right? This became, as we were saying, a big deal, right? Because became ever more complex and costly was object of a gradual attention from the side of public powers that attempted to bring it under control. In fact, much of the definition of chivalry from a literary, cultural, also juridical point of view, mostly in the second half of the 12th century, it corresponds to a lock of the military class. It is to say, up to that point, knighthood had been relatively open to everybody. Right now, it was ever more overlapping with nobility, and the nobility couldn't take in everybody. Right, this brought to very important changes in Europe eventually, because from one side it defined nobility in a way that would last, as we've seen, either between 1792 or 1918, but also set certain standards in the relation between nobility and the rest of the community, which also militarily-wise was a big deal, as the following centuries would prove as well. But otherwise, before, a miles was literally everybody who could fight on horseback, in a sense, and because if they were able to do that, they could literally seize more power by themselves. Instead, Europe civilizes. The 12th century's moment of the consolidation of the feudal monarchies. There is something of more centralized power emerging from a decentralized system, largely, and therefore these authorities start bringing order on this same mass of people, and that's where also military developments naturally increase dramatically, because again, there is the passage from individuality, in a sense, to collectivity, and of course the collectivity, militarily speaking, with that discipline received from the top, incredibly brutal and violent one, but dramatically effective to create military machines, creates much more developed military system. And so just the horsemen roaming around, plundering, being a sort of brigand and living on as an errant fighter cannot quite survive, right? The church, the empire, the secular authorities began to have a more consistent grip on society and to order and discipline and pacify as well, which naturally means taking people out, but there is no other way to pacify, right? And never seen as autonomy, as this, without cooperation, as a civilizational achievement, because it's really, there is something that doesn't work there, must be settled in a way or another. We're talking about an extremely bloody century, right? The 12th is considered, the first Renaissance, right? It was one of the most tormented centuries in medieval times. People lived at the time, right? There were lots of problems in this aspect, because of course the grip was also creating resistance, right? As it had happened already before, the affirmation, the vassalic beneficiary system in lands like Germany, that were used to, in Carolingian times, were used to not just to live in another way, right? Mostly in a clinic sense, where every mobster kind of wanted to do whatever they want. They rebelled. I mean, the Saxons took generation to bring down. The Stanlinger revolt was also a big deal in Eastern France. But again, what model did win in the end? And always remember that passed through a military action, and there was a moral military superiority, which is the same one that spreads from this Frankish world broadly meant to the surroundings and defines, in a sense, our westernness in an important sense. And definitely the culminating moment of the process of self-identification of the group, of the militia, was the elaboration of, or at least the drafting, or the systematization, the categorization of a behavioral code, right? That at that point wasn't emerging quite, in fact, as let's say, as anything new in terms of what the values of loyalty to, for example, to the senior, to the retinue leader, this is to be found also in non-post-Carolingian worlds. So clinic societies work in a sense like that, where military retinues, think about, I don't know, the Norse, think about the Celts. I mean, this preceded what we mean as chivalry in a strictly low medieval sense. And in fact, here defined reciprocal loyalty, where this loyalty evidently hadn't quite existed before, and at least in a bigger scale, and on the binding role of the word of honor, right? That passed also through the sacralization of certain oaths of fealty, as you know, that were a big deal because they were the public, were publicly swearing on, on the Bible and things that at that time were crucial to make that society work. And naturally, this is the culmination probably of a moral drive that said we need to adjust society in a way or another. So even if this was kind of a primitive system, statally speaking, but still it was a big deal because in the process it also exalted chivalry and by locking it and making it become more elite, and justified altogether their raison d'être and their privilege. And because they had a dramatic responsibility and task and function, so their quality had to be properly certified. And that's how powerful that individual burden was for these people eventually at the same time. So there will be a lot to tell, especially about this last topic, because it's difficult for us to understand what it is, not just a community without a state, modernly or contemporarily meant, but what it is, and this is again the diachronic perspective is quite not considered, a world that has never known a statal entity, right? And so a world that by default, morally speaking, comes from another direction, if you want, that has to be at least realigned, and it takes really the sword to do that. But at the same time, it's the same people who decide that, right? It's the same people who felt the need to achieve this this organization, because objectively, before it was a wild situation, right? There had been properly a sense of malaise for saying that there must be an order, there must be an authority. The whole Middle Ages is permeated by this need, right? And this reflection that was starting to toy properly with ideas of what about the communities, what about the leaders, how do we have to regulate this? But this began in a civil sense, so naturally on the base of other, on the base of the law of either civil law or common law or the Bible, and other cultural, influences. But it was the beginning of a great reflection, a systematic one, right? As systematic as soundly, glued together as much as feudalism was able to achieve within the same community, right? We think of these systems medievally speaking as, decentralized. This is especially a modernistic prejudice. Well, what we see here is exactly the opposite trend. The Middle Ages struggled to centralize even further. Of course, centralization did exist. Never be fooled by modernistic perspective that tells you about before the Renaissance there was no centralization. This doesn't exist. In every human community there is a degree of centralization. Otherwise, you can't really literally do anything, right? It's something genetically imbued and brought in our behavior that serves to literally to survive in the face of threat. And so that's why public security is the first need of a functional government, because without that, you practically can't do anything, and that's how first human societies were to properly to survive, and hopefully managing to improve over time. If you're not safe, you can't do anything. So there were many ways naturally in which that we cannot talk about now, but which the chivalry illustrated and celebrated itself, with the creation of the so-called chivalric literature, the adoption of heraldic symbols and personal insignia, or the spread of that great spectacle that the tournament was, which even in here was hardly anything like a game or a simple propaganda, right? Later on, the tournament became better defined, and we know it mostly for the late Middle Ages, even the early modern age, and that's the show that we're mostly visually and unfortunately interested in. But tournaments were essentially the center of all those essential form of training that had always existed, including those same initiatory rights in a way to properly qualify the warrior. So much that at the beginning of this period, tournaments are indistinguishable from battles, right? Tournaments at the beginning were literally battles in everything. There wasn't literally any single difference, because battles were fought in the same way. People died in the same way. The places were destroyed in the same way. It was all one. It was just doing the same thing. And these, again, you have to think, again, the psychological profile of these people that took a liking. À la guerre que jolie, for example. They liked. They said it's beautiful to go out there in the good season, to ride and charge and fight, to break bones. They enjoyed these kind of things because they were so unavoidably and existentially and inescapably imbued with the sense that there was no, by the way, was a quite evident one, there was no other way to make anything political but war, because of course there was always the next guy who was up to, making his own interest, and it was all that fluid that, of course, they couldn't but love war for themselves. And there was a lot of warriorism, in fact, imbued in this. And yes, it's still a primitive form of war. But as we've just illustrated in the following centuries, this thing was ever more mediated, disciplined, right, and always, more scholarly developed in functionally. And if you study Fleury, that is definitely the greatest expert on chivalry as such in this sense, he underlined how the fundamental role in the public acceptation of the system of values of the milites was covered by the church, right? And this is also one of the greatest and most important civilizational achievements in the history of the world. This is far beyond the West, considering how echoing and resounding and persistent the result was. That is to give a Christian and moral best to an atheist that was principally connected, as we were saying before, in the primordial root of tribalism, etc., to the physical oppression and on the pure warlike superiority of the individual, right? And the church in this was a great discipliner in the process. That is, the secular and ecclesiastical authorities worked very hard, very persistently, very successfully to discipline the community, to present a model that presented always this conscious tension between what was had to be done, what was, however, still an evil, that these rulers were brought always to consider. That is to say, it's always a double threat, right? There are certain so you cannot quite achieve the greatest things without sinning, right? You have to be able to look beyond this, and you have to evaluate a deeper moral and way more developed moral system than the one that simply says, no, just killing is wrong, but so never do it. Western values are not in this, right? Western values says that if in the Bible itself, because remember, there is nothing more unchristian than being a pacifist, right? Every pacifist is not a Christian by definition. Christianity is a pacific religion, not a pacifist religion. The Bible is this. If you look at the Gospels, there is this constant conceptual divide, of course, between the inner world, the spiritual one, and the outer world, the secular one. That are two very different things, because which is an extremely scientific, spot-on realization. That is to say, you not only live in a world of reality that you have to cope with, and that is malevolent, is dangerous, is mysterious, etc., but you are the only one who is deeply responsible for your own actions, right? There is hardly anything more empowering than this thought. That is to say, what you have to respond for yourself is superior in quality, right, to the world you live in, materially speaking. That you have to make sense, because that world has been entrusted to you, right, as a creation, and you have to make sense of it. You have to create order out of chaos. And in order to do it, you have to go out there, and there is no way to do it without sinning, right? Because you are challenged constantly by the same thing. And these ethics is probably one of the most functional to any disciplinary standard that you can find civilizationally wide. That is to say, if you don't pass through this, you will. If you don't have a freedom of conscience, if you just obey blindly, right, to something that you fundamentally don't even understand, you are just done for, right? I presume that a great part of the military superiority of the West, how it has developed again within the centuries, has deeply to do with this mindset, because it, again, as von Clausewitz said, war is about moral forces. War is a struggle between moral forces that reciprocally influence each other. It's not about how following a manual or pretending that there is a magic formula that solves everything, or that you just have to blindly obey to carry out. Every time we did this, everything was lost. Right, everything went down, properly from a military point of view. The greatest military disasters in the history of mankind, namely the Schlieffen Plan and Operation Barbarossa, were due to this complete, hubris of the dramatically dangerous idea of superiority. Right, that of unmatchable superiority provided by a certain culture that could, at that point, not really care, could underestimate the world. If you underestimate the world, it's over. Right? That's why, individuals like, I don't know, Little Heart, right? There was a thief, a charlatan, one of the most radically morally inferior individuals in the history of mankind, that people still think today is a kind of a military expert. But these are the people who completely ruined all the military historical perception. You can't even complain there is culturalism around with King and all these things, because again, that's exactly when we lost any understanding. Right, that those are the people who said von Clausewitz was, for example, responsible for National Socialism, or all the bullshit. It's so atrocious for the massacres of World War I. It's so atrociously stupid that sometimes you wonder but why did some people had to exist? Well, having this caution, this sense of responsibility, these ideas of realizing that you can always fail, because you're not purely the righteous one. That human nature is unavoidably rigged by sin, and that still you are transfigured if you maintain this this firm awareness of the complexity of reality, and that you never stop to one single thing. There you have, that's a purely scientific principle, by the way, right? It's not a surprise that, you know, the most biblical paradigms are being scientifically completely properly absorbed in a much deeper philosophical and scientific sense, in order to understand the world, because of course these were things that were already known before, that mankind had experienced way before we thought, again, from the hubris of an alleged superiority, that we could redraw in a way that could, you know, essentially have nothing to do with the previous past, because of course we wouldn't even be able to distinguish the context of it from our own, are at the root, are the sap of civilization. That's why they are universal values. Well, the European Middle Ages that expressed such vision in the even in the crusading institution, in the properly in the idea of a constant regulation of the political and military activity from a moral, not just a material point of view, or so not from a spiritual, not just secular point of view, properly realizing that there is always an ultimate purpose that is not what we can measure simply as a on the range of, you know, just what our poor cognitive means, and therefore being extremely aware of the limits is what has allowed, in a world like that one, to consolidate a system like the Western one that basically hasn't, of course, it's everything historically can be interpreted as an accident, right? These, if there hadn't been an Alexander the Great, there would have not been a West as we know it, right? And reflect on the fact that the great heroes of medieval epics are somebody like Alexander the Great, right? Not other. So always remember again of the root of what was brought in that society, what it had meant, why this system had been able to exist in the first place. That was understood at the time, right? And it always passed through a military form and a religious form. Well, that's the power. Right, that's the capacity, that's the strength, that's the success. That's what made Western chivalry up to a very recent past, and that now we have become completely oblivious of, because we have essentially thrown out of the window something so simple like, you know, scientific method, moral responsibility. And this is not a good moment for our world because of it. All right, so for today, on this note, I don't know how to comment my own words, but I hope that it makes you reflect in some ways. I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.